Danika Waddell is an intentional investor out now on Epsilon Theory YouTube. You want to hear this. We talk about what it's like as a planner, setting up your own firm, hopping off the career ladder elsewhere, jumping onto yours, her husband's layoff story, what they've been going through as a family, how you put context around all this stuff when there is no generational wisdom coming down above you. You got to hear this. Jack Forehand, roll some clips.
I realized, wow, I actually have a lot less control here than I thought I did. My income dropped by 50% during this process. And I was like, wow, my career might end because my company screwed up some paperwork. I thought this was the safe thing to do, is to work for another company as opposed to doing something risky like launching a firm. One of my primary goals in terms of launching a firm and serving the population that I serve is I don't want women to be in that situation ever, whether it's divorce or something else that happens where they have nothing and they're having to rebuild. And I watched my mother do that more than once, actually. I'm pretty like, okay, well, we've decided we're going to launch a firm. Like, I guess it's time to do it. It's not like, oh, let's do some focus groups and think about it for 6 months and create a bunch of spreadsheets. It's like, no, I'm launching a firm. Like, let's go. I'm so engaged and I'm so passionate about what I do. And I just can't imagine being in a role where I'm not excited and motivated and inspired and engaged, which I feel pretty much every day.
Welcome to The Intentional Investor with Matt Zeigler, where he and his guests explore the intersection of investing and life, portfolio, and purpose. Nothing in this podcast is investment advice. Nothing in this podcast is advising you to buy or sell any security or to do anything with your money. Seriously, you should only act on investment advice from someone you know and who knows your unique situation. We are not that person. Matt Zeigler is a managing director at Sun Point Investments, and the opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Sun Point Investments or of Second Foundation Partners. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of Sun Point Investments.
You're watching The Intentional Investor right here on Epsilon Theory YouTube. I'm Matt Zeigler, and this guest today. Now, she is truly a modern Lucy Lawless, not because she hates laws, quite the contrary. She's very lawful, and we might even discuss how her career almost derailed because she stood firm when her employer wasn't following the rules. But I'm talking Lucy Lawless, the timeless actress. Let's review some roles in case you're not familiar. First, Diane Lewis Swanson from Parks and Recreation, all about self-efficiency, independence, family values, simplifying the complex into actionable steps, even if it's just filling a pothole in town. Our guest embodies these traits, understanding self-reliance, valuing her family, and breaking down complications into manageable parts and steps. Now, the next Lucy Lawless character, Ruby Noby from Ash vs. Evil Dead, a leader who takes charge with a clear mission and inspires everyone around her. Similarly, this guest leads her own firm with a crystal clear mission serving women in tech and inspires the financial planning community as a serious voice for change. And finally, I know she knows this coming because we're talking about Lucy Lawless, Xena, warrior princess. Lucy's iconic role embodying redemption, transformation, inclusivity, and supporting underserved groups. Our guest likewise transformed her career, champions inclusivity, and tells a bigger story about making the finance industry better than she found it. Xena Financial Planning founder, media personality as seen in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Market Watch, and apparently a whole bunch more. The warrior queen of diversity, equity, and inclusion for financial services, Danika Waddell. Welcome to the show.
Matt, that was quite an intro. And I didn't actually tell you, but my oldest child is named Lucy. So funny little connection there.
All right, hang on a second. Is she named Lucy after Lucy Lawless, though?
She's not, no.
Okay,
but you could assume that.
I am going to assume that if I ever meet her. I'm telling that I'm pretty sure. The threads are all there. You gotta give me credit. There was no Danica Patrick references. There was no, I got really close. Were you in Philly for a while? Do you have any ties to?
I do.
I
do have Philly ties.
You ever go to Danik's? You ever eat at Danik's? You have a broccoli ramen sandwich? No. Okay.
No, sounds great though. Oh, is that in the terminal market, the Reading terminal market?
Well, yeah, there's a location there.
Yeah, it sounds familiar. I'm not sure I've ever had the sandwich. Okay. Yeah.
All right. That's like outside of getting like a cheesesteak in Philadelphia, like the next sandwich is possibly the greatest sandwich known to mankind. So I avoided all these things in favor of Lucy Lawless just for you. Start me with Xena Warrior Princess. I'm really curious. Did you watch it in the 90s? Who'd you watch it with? What was that experience for you?
I didn't actually watch it.
Netflix?
Yeah,
Someone
it's kind of hard to
you connect
believe.
with it?
I think I've watched, when I was launching the firm and chose the name, I think I went and watched 1 or 2 episodes just because I wanted to make sure I wasn't like connecting myself to something that was problematic. So I think I watched 1 or 2 episodes, but that was as far as I got.
In the 1 or 2 episodes, like, was it just the due diligence check to make sure you weren't stubbing your toe on depth of character? Did it match everything you thought?
It did. Yeah. I mean, it definitely was what I was expecting, in terms of everything that you think of when you imagine Xena Warrior Princess, which is just a very bold, powerful, does not need a man, take charge kind of person. So yeah, it was right in line with what I was going for with the firm name.
All right, that checks out. And I was also thinking, and I know I looked it up because I was trying to remember what I saw. Was it Gabrielle? What was the assistant?
Oh yeah.
Do we know? That was her, boy wonder, to borrow the Batman phrasing.
Right. Her sidekick.
Yeah.
I can't remember the actress's name. I think Gabrielle sounds right.
Gabrielle sounds right. Yeah. I was thinking about this because I love the name of the firm. I love the thing, and I love Xena spun off from like Hercules. This was a family activity for us in like the mid to late 90s there. And you just didn't see anything like it in the pre-Marvel Cinematic Universe. This is a really important character. It stands for a lot of really cool stuff.
Yeah, I agree. And for those of us that remember Xena Warrior Princess, if you were awake in the 90s and had some sense that was happening, just the name is very evocative. You don't have to say a whole lot more other than Xena, and you're immediately in that frame of mind where you just understand that this is a very powerful take charge woman.
All right, so I promise you we won't be hitting you with deep cuts and questions about Xena episodes that we do or do not remember. Take me all the way back. I want to talk about where'd you grow up? Where in the country were you and the family? And tell me a little bit about mom and dad.
I grew up in Western New York, Buffalo, New York, and I did live in Philly for a little while, lived, kind of up and down the East Coast. But I moved to Seattle in 2000. So I've been here for 25 years. And my family, pretty humble beginnings. My mom was a teacher. My dad worked in a hospital administration. They divorced really young, right, when I was young. So I was 5 when my parents split up. And my dad was more middle class. My mom really struggled, despite having a college degree. She didn't really have a career before having kids. And I wasn't aware of it at the time, but it really does directly connect to what I do today, because what I noticed was just a real disparity in how my parents were able to live. So my mom really struggled. She relied a lot on the help of friends. She ultimately, went back and got her master's degree and became a teacher. But for many years there, things were lean. And I just was very cognizant of the fact that, she had not worked while she was raising us in those early years, and just, she had nothing. And so one of my primary goals, I know you didn't ask about this part, but, in terms of launching a firm and serving the population that I serve, is I don't want women to be in that situation ever, whether it's divorce or something else that happens where they have nothing and they're having to rebuild. And I, watched my mother do that more than once, actually. But that early experience, I think, was pretty formative, even though, again, I was not aware of it at the time.
Siblings? How many siblings?
Mm-hmm. I'm the oldest of 3 girls.
Important. And as the oldest, you carry all the responsibility of the other two.
I'm definitely the quintessential oldest daughter, 100%, and oldest granddaughter.
Fantastic.
Yep.
As similarly an oldest of 3, I can relate. 3 boys in my family. The whole, like, the divorce and the splitting, I promise this is not going to devolve into therapy really fast, but I'm just curious, like, as that splits apart, how aware are you? 5's a good young age to be thrown into that mixer, but when do you start to realize, is it right out the gate you start to realize the disparity between the 2 households, or just the approaches being taken?
I think so. I mean, I don't recall exactly when sort of we were on like, my mom was on food stamps, things like that. We lived in, my dad, for whatever reason, I mean, it was an amicable divorce for the most part. But my dad stayed in the home that they owned, and my mom like moved into an apartment on the third floor of a friend's house. And so we had this like very cramped space. So again, we got by, but it was very clear that there was a pretty big discrepancy between the way that money was handled and sort of the things that we were able to do. My dad didn't have a lot, but, much more stable. My mom was like a waitress for many years in that period of time. So it was just, like I said, it was very clear that without sort of the assistance of friends or people, sort of opening their doors and loaning us things like that, we just did not have the same ability as like my dad's household did.
What was Dad doing? What did his career take off like in your younger years when you started to remember it?
Dad worked in a hospital. He was like an administrator, and he did fine, very like middle class, but he hated his job. And I remember that actually being very impactful when I was a kid as well, because for the entire time that I knew him, up until when he retired at 55, took a very early retirement, he hated his job and he never left it until he retired. And I remember thinking, gosh, I really don't want that. Like, whatever I do, I didn't know what I wanted to do as a kid, but I definitely don't want to have a job that I'm miserable in. And I would say to him things like, well, why don't you go get a new job? And he's like, oh, I can't. I've got obligations. And it was like, well, sure, but there must be other jobs out there that you could do. And he just never had the creativity or whatever, wasn't able to sort of take that leap. Which I feel like I've done a couple times in my life where I've taken a big leap and done something risky, like launching a firm. And my dad never did that. And, for whatever reason, he sort of stayed with this secure, stable job, but hated it. So that also had a pretty strong impact on me as a kid of just like, I definitely don't want that.
Yeah, and to cling really hard to a ladder like that, and then presumably,
Mm-hmm.
come home and talk about it. For you to
Mm-hmm.
know he hates this job that he goes to every day.
Mm-hmm.
That worms its way
And as
into-
an adult, I mean, it took me, 15 plus years after finishing my bachelor's degree before I found financial planning. So it was a while before I discovered this as a career. And I'm so engaged and I'm so passionate about what I do. And I just can't imagine being in a role where I'm not excited and motivated and inspired and engaged, which I feel pretty much every day. So that's just really important to me. Again, it took me a while. I'm not saying I felt inspired and engaged every single day I got out of bed since I graduated from college, but I figured it out, and I was willing to take some risks and pivots and things along the way to get there.
What about mom? What about mom on the same like relationship with work
Mm-hmm.
journey? Did that she went back and got the degree. What was it like?
Mm-hmm. She went back to college in her 30s. So I can remember like when I was in high school and taking the SATs, she was taking, I think, the GMATs and applying to grad school when I was applying to college. So we were kind of on a similar path there. But then she became a teacher. She worked in public schools and has a nice pension and, pretty also very stable, kind of conservative path. But she was, she pivoted in her mid 30s, and I was like, okay, what I'm doing is not a path that, is particularly lucrative or has a lot of stability. So I think seeing somebody go back to school in their 30s was pretty cool. And then, I went and got my master's degree in my mid 40s. So I was kind of like, oh, hey mom, cool. Look, I'm actually following in your footsteps in a certain regard. So I think that was helpful to see. But she really prioritized, because she was a single mom, she prioritized working in a school because she had more free time. She had summers off, she could be with the kids. So that was definitely one of her priorities, which wasn't something that I prioritized when I was going through similar changes.
Was there any talk about it when she was gearing up to make the decision with you, with the kids? Was there any like, mom's going to go back to school and stuff's going to be a little crazy while I figure this out?
I think there must have been, but I actually can't remember it. I was in high school, like I said, so I think I was probably pretty self-absorbed, like most high schoolers are. As a parent of two high schoolers, I can confirm that they're somewhat self-absorbed. So I'm sure that there were.
It's interesting. And I'm asking that question half thinking, both of my parents did kind of the same thing too. And I'm asking that thinking like, I don't really remember them talking about it, but I'm positive they did. And I just remember when they were in the thick of those moments and studying and like, be quiet or whatever. Here's the textbook spread out on the kitchen table.
Yeah. I definitely remember having those conversations with my kids when I was going back. And when I was, taking the CFP coursework and studying for that exam. And then in grad school, it's kind of like, okay, this is how life is going to be for a little while. And I mean, again, I don't know that it's not that they didn't care, but I think they were just kind of like, okay, cool. Like as long as you're around and dinner's on the table and sort of all the basic needs are met, they didn't seem to care a whole heck of a lot. But I definitely remember having those conversations very explicitly with my children.
Yeah, it's interesting how we talk about that stuff at home. That type of like advancement where it's like what you have to throw on your own shoulders versus what you share with the group of people. Like, I'm doing this for a reason, not just to annoy you. Right?
I'm not sure they totally get the reason, but
no.
I think they can see that there's a curiosity that I'm not willing to ignore. I want to learn more. I want to get better at what I do. And so they can see me taking very intentional steps to increase my knowledge or increase my skills or, expose myself to different ways of thinking. So I think they can draw that connection pretty easily.
No, that's great. What about so in high school, as the interests start to merge, start thinking about college, what are the big, we already established there's no Xena warrior princess telling you what to do. What were the key influences? What's getting you interested in, I want to study this or pursue this on my own, even if it's just I need to get out of my house, because that's part of it.
Yeah, we've been having this conversation so much in my house because, as I mentioned before we started recording, I've got a high school senior. So there's a lot of discussion about where one ends up and how one decides what to study and what you're interested in. And it's so fascinating to me because, most 18-year-olds have no idea what they want to do, right? And in my conversations with other people, as my kid is going through this process, it seems pretty clear that none of us, now in our 30s, 40s, 50s, none of us had any idea what we wanted to do. And I had, when I went away to college, I tried a few things. I sort of landed on a math major, mostly because I had a bunch of credits in math already. And I was like, well, this seems to be working. But it wasn't something where I was like, gosh, math is my thing. It had always come somewhat naturally to me, but it wasn't exciting by any stretch of the imagination. So yeah, it just seemed kind of random at the time. And then I ended up with a psychology minor, which also seemed kind of like, yeah, it was kind of interesting. And so at the college, when I was in college, I had no idea how those things were going to show up in my career. And here I am 30 years later as a financial planner, and I'm like, math and psychology, of course, it makes perfect sense. But I didn't have that foresight. I didn't even know what a financial planner was when I was in college. That wasn't on my radar at all. So, I think, and so many of my friends who are other advisors are, English degrees and history, and people came from all sorts of backgrounds. So I think like most people, I had absolutely no idea. And it took me 15 plus years to finally find what I think is the perfect combination of all of my interests and skills.
What's the draw? Specifically to the math, how'd you fumble your way into math? Were you the AP calculus kid? What kid were you that you had the audacity to declare an entire
I was in math
subject?
league.
You were a math league. Okay.
I was in math league.
Do we have any other TV references I can get? Math at the PBS show where they held the calculators like guns. Did you watch that one?
No, that doesn't ring a bell. Then maybe really my vibe. No, it was something that I was good at and always was, in accelerated classes. And again, just sort of started taking it in college because that's what I'd always done. I was good at other things too, though. So I'm not really sure why math ended up sticking. But because as I've said to other people in my life, particularly my kid, math in college was really hard. I did well in high school, but at the college level, I didn't ever get a single A. in my entire major. So it was not easy. So I'm not really sure how I ended up in that discipline, to be perfectly honest. But it was something that I was good at and kind of just carried on.
Any remarkable or noteworthy math league victories? Did you guys go and do the different school
Oh, yeah.
competitions and all that?
Well, I mean, it's a little embarrassing to boast about this 30 years later, but
You
I
should
was
flex.
the top scoring high school senior in the Buffalo Public Schools, and I won a laptop when I was a senior in high school for being the top math league person. So, which is pretty exciting at the time. My parents couldn't afford to buy me a laptop, so I went away to college with a new. I mean, it was about 3 inches thick. I can't remember what it was. Some kind of
Got really hot.
math.
Been on your lap too long. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. It was a beast, but it's free laptop. So
Okay. Okay. Do you know, does the record still stand? Have you been dethroned?
oh, I'm sure. I think it's just an annual. At the time, it was an annual. Whoever was the top senior that year. I don't think there was any kind of like point. I don't know. I can't remember how they did it actually. All I remember is the laptop.
You got a good award out of it.
I
Okay, so
did.
how does the psych minor happen in college? Because again, like the math thing is a whole other
Mhm.
beast. But then who
Mhm.
just picks up like a casual interest, or how's that even happen?
I think, like I took a lot of random classes, like a philosophy class and a religion class and a bunch of random things. And psychology was one that I tried and I was pretty fascinated. I really enjoyed my psych classes in undergrad. Not that I could recall exactly what about them was fascinating, but I do definitely remember sort of the human development angle just being totally different from anything that I'd learned about before.
Was it one of those like where you have to, I'm trying to remember what they call it at my college, like all university curriculum or something painfully boring sounding, where like you would take these random classes where they'd mix you with the other schools and majors, but then sometimes you'd find out from one of those kids, they're like, oh, I'm taking this, literature class or psych class or something. And that's kind of how you fall into that rabbit hole.
Yeah, I don't really remember that, but it is funny actually when I did my grad school degree again, in my 40s, so many years later, the program I went through at Golden Gate University, you could take electives and all of my electives were in the psych department. It was still because it was a master's in advanced financial planning, but it had a life planning focus. And so several of the classes were kind of in a psychology vein anyway. I think maybe they were cross-listed or something like that, but all of my electives were in the psych department, which probably wouldn't surprise me based on the other thing, sort of just saying again, that area of development. And even one of the classes I took was about sort of how we age and sort of cognition, how that progresses over the decades, and how some of our, particularly in what we do as financial advisors, we have very clear ideas about how people's cognition kind of declines over time. And as they age, they need more assistance with certain, say, financial tasks, and how some of that is actually that's not really accurate, much of it. It's just that's sort of our societal perception that people's cognition really declines in a very precipitous manner. But I mean, I think it happens in very specific chunks where, there is a period of time where you see a big change and then it's pretty stable for a long time. And then you might see another big decline and then it's stable for a long time, but it doesn't sort of drop off dramatically over time, if that makes sense. So I still think those topics are fascinating to me. And again, they do impact our work as financial advisors.
What's the end of college like? So first 4-year school stint. Was there a job on the other side? Were you like, hey, this is the path in front of me. I see a ladder I want to climb. Or was it, oh no, I'm going to go whatever you do?
No, not really. I taught math for a little while. This is when I was in Philly. So I taught high school math when I was 21
Did you get a
teaching.
teaching degree or what?
No,
certification?
I was teaching I was at a private school. Yep. I was at a friend's school in Philly, which I loved. I loved the friend's schools. I thought they were doing some really cool stuff in the education space. But Yeah, I taught high school, like juniors and seniors when I was 21. It was hard. I loved the teaching part, but the sort of classroom management, I was absolutely terrible at. So I didn't
Okay.
last very long, but I tried it. And, but I did like the education part. And so again, when I think of my work as a financial advisor, educating is a big priority to me. Like it's important to me that my clients understand as much as they want to. I mean, some clients don't really care and don't want to know the difference between, different types of bonds or something like that. But I do enjoy being able to break concepts down for people that might find them otherwise overwhelming.
Oh, what about the classroom management was so frustrating?
I think it was like just the discipline and sort of managing the dynamics of kids that they thought I was their friend because I was so close in age, or like I would go to like a hip hop concert on a weekend and see my class, my
Right.
students. And it was like, it was just a little bit hard. I think if I'd been a little bit older, if I'd been more like 25, there would have been more of an obvious separation. But I just had a hard time establishing kind of my authority as the teacher and sort of managing classroom dynamics. It just wasn't my skill set, or it certainly wasn't at that age. Maybe I could do a better job now, I hope.
I am sure you could, but I also get that. There's a weird dynamic there when you can't establish, like the teacher student hierarchy is kind of steeped in all of our brains. And anything that we also know, kids are heathens. So anytime you like tilt that scale and give them a direct mode of attack, chaos ensues.
It was a little chaotic. Not too bad. I mean, it wasn't like people were throwing paper airplanes at me, but
What happens after that? What do you do after teaching?
I moved around a little bit, sort of lived in a couple different places, ended up in Seattle in my mid-20s and did a variety of like accounting type roles, just learned on the job. It was easy. I was good at it. And that's kind of what I ended up doing for more than 10 years, was just, working in small companies. I worked in some startups here in Seattle, which was actually really good experience from a variety of perspectives because I was working with tech people and I was in some cases getting stock options. And I also really liked the environment of being in a small enough group where if you wanted to make a difference or you saw something you wanted to improve, you actually could do that versus working in a big organization where it's just, this is how things are done. So I really liked working in like the startup environment where it was very dynamic. People really had, everyone was very engaged and you really had the ability to impact what the organization did.
Why Seattle? How'd that happen? That's a big jump from Buffalo.
Yeah, I had some friends that were living out here and they sort of talked me into coming. I was here. I think I came out to visit on a beautiful Seattle summer day, which if you've ever been here, they're magical, and we're hanging out on Lake Union and the boats are there and the seaplanes landing. And I was like, yeah, I'll move here. I had never seen a Seattle winter, but here I am 25 years later. So
it's the way it works. Any place that you visit, if you don't check yourself,
see it at its worst.
Yeah, you got to check yourself by like, what's the worst time of year to live in this?
It's not that bad in the winter, but the gray takes a little bit of getting used to.
You get used to it, but it's still a lot. Okay, so you follow some friends out there for opportunity. You get into it's kind of a funny thing, like the math in school is part of what makes the accounting jobs feel easy. Like it's just, this is way better than, I don't know, some fancy calculus formula that I'm not going to revert to quadratic equation or something, but something more complicated. So it feels easy. Like it felt like, the donuts came off the bat. All of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm really good at this. Like I can nestle right into this.
I was good at it. It wasn't satisfying at some level, it was just sort of like, I liked that it was very kind of clean, there's always like a right answer and there's a right way to do things. And, but it wasn't stimulating in any way. So after, 10 plus years of doing that, I was like, all right, well, I'm pretty good at this. And I've kind of moved my way up in various organizations, but I don't really see this as a long-term path for myself. And it was probably in my early 30s that I even started to hear about financial planning, so I spent a good couple years just like, is this, a direction I want to take? And did a ton of research and those sorts of things before I like officially, I also was having babies in my early 30s. So I wasn't necessarily super keen on making a career change with newborns, but it was through those several years where I was kind of like, all right, just me and QuickBooks and spreadsheets all day long. It's like a little bit, I want to do something a little bit more meaningful.
When and where along the line do you meet your partner, your husband?
Shortly after I moved to Seattle, we met in my mid-20s. So, pretty early days. And he is also not from Seattle, but we've been here for a quarter of a century. So
Time flies when you're having careers and babies. Where's she from originally? Where in the country as a transfer?
Scotland.
Scotland.
He's
Outside
not
the
from
country.
the US. Yeah. Outside
Okay.
the country. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So a little further than I came, but
A wee bit, as he might say.
exactly.
This idea of and he's in the tech sector somewhere. You don't have to divulge about that, but he's a tech sector person because everybody lives in Seattle.
Totally.
Pretty much is required to be in tech sector
Mostly.
adjacent, if nothing else. Is the whole, you get together, you start having kids, your careers, and are you guys about the same age? Are you close in age?
He's a little older. He's in his mid-50s.
Okay. So not a huge age
Yeah.
gap, but a little age gap. Like as you're going through this stuff and figuring it out, especially with kids, are you starting to talk to each other about just career progression and what this means for you? Because you're carrying, I don't want to call it like baggage to the table, but what you saw mom and dad go through, you've definitely got some perspective with an accounting job you don't entirely love, and then now raising kids under you while you do it. What was going through your head with all that?
Well, it was definitely my husband's career and compensation and all that stuff that kind of got me interested in financial planning from the outset, because he came to the US to work for Amazon.com. So was receiving RSUs early on. And when we first got married and I was doing our taxes, I was like, I don't understand what these things are. I don't know how they work. How does the tax work? And so, of course, I educated myself. But I thought, wow, there must be like, thousands of people in Seattle that are dealing with the same thing. And at the time, I also was really interested in sort of like the cross-border aspect of it, of, coming from another country, maybe having assets in more than one country and sort of part of it as well. So initially I thought I kind of wanted to work with people like us, like people that came to the US to work for a tech company, and maybe, and many of my clients today are from either they're from another country or their parents were from another country and kind of came here. So they don't have a lot of sort of generational knowledge about what the heck is a 401k, never heard of one before, or things like that. So it was really through, getting to understand my husband's compensation and doing our own taxes and all that stuff that I thought, wow, this is like, A, it's interesting. And B, there's an awful lot of people that are probably in the same boat I'm in, where they're trying to figure this stuff out, don't really have the family, support to be able to just pick up the phone and say, hey, Dad, like explain this to me or whatever. So that was kind of the early genesis of me being like, I think I could do this, help other people with these problems.
And part of this is just because you're doing the accounting for the household. Like you're doing taxes and whatever else. And he's giving you a pay stub or whatever. And he's like, I don't know what this is. But you're
That's
the math
exactly
manager
right.
with the accounting. Okay.
I mean, he's pretty smart too, but what I was doing the taxes. So yeah, I mean, and it sort of evolved where I decided to go back and get the CFP coursework and take the exam and then change careers. But he's been pretty supportive along the way of, starting to launch a firm. I mean, obviously has a really big impact on the household and our financial situation. So yeah, he kind of needed to be on board, I think.
Yeah. And maybe I don't want to like jump way too far ahead in the concept of it, but there's a really big difference between talking to people who are like an executive inside of something and somebody who's an owner who actually owns the thing. It's a really big mindset difference. And there's a lot of things that are similar because like ownership and equity are kind of the same thing, mathematically speaking. but there's a
Right.
world of psychology between the two of them. You guys are embodying that in one household. I just,
Yeah. I don't think I fully appreciated what it's like to own your own business and how much it sort of takes over your life. I mean, I'm not a workaholic by any means, but it's just you don't turn it off in the same way that you do if it's your 9 to 5 job. Even when your 9 to 5 job means you're working a lot more than 9 to 5, you do ultimately have the ability to turn it off. Whereas I think when it's your firm, that doesn't ever go away. If it's kind of always in the background or more likely the foreground.
did you and your husband, did you talk about that as a specific thing? This is a very common conversation in my house too. Like being aware
Hmm.
of that reality, specifically that it's
Hmm.
hard to turn off the thing that you own. Did you guys
Yeah.
talk about that much?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it was a little bit of a surprise for both of us how that evolved and really became so obvious to both of us. And in particular, because my husband's from Europe, he's got a much different um, ability to sort of leave work at work. The sort of American culture where we're plugged in and checking email all the time isn't really how things or they haven't historically been that way in Europe. They're much better at taking real vacations where you actually go away for 3 whole weeks and things like that. So he's actually very good at compartmentalizing work, even though he's worked in high pressure, high stress jobs. He turns it off, and I think we were both a little surprised, but especially him, to see how much it just doesn't go away. And I like work, so I often work on the weekends, and that's just sort of not in his nature.
How did you think about, or how did you talk about it with, especially with raising a young family, now a less young family, but how'd you guys balance that?
Mhm. I mean, my work has always been the more flexible. I've always been the person that, took the kids to the pediatrician and things like that because my husband just always had really demanding jobs where he was in meetings and just he didn't have that kind of flexibility. And then with launching my firm, I had even more flexibility. So, in many ways, that was a good thing for our household because I think even if both people are working, it's pretty important to have at least one person that can, go pick up a kid from school if they're sick or whatever. And interestingly enough, my husband got laid off at the beginning of this year. It's the first time he's ever been laid off, in all the years in tech. And it's been a huge change in our household to have now he's the one that takes the kids to the pediatrician and picks them up from school and, and cooks dinner and grocery shops and all these things. So it's been a really dynamic or a dramatic change in just sort of like the household duties.
All right, what's that like? Let's sit with me on this for a second. That's a big change. And I know this is probably,
It's huge.
we're at the end of March. This is pretty fresh, I guess, in
Yes.
experience. But
Mhm.
how
Mhm.
are you thinking about that? Where's the notes from the old psych degree? Are you brushed any of this off as
Yeah.
you're
Yeah. Oh
packing
my
this?
gosh. It's a very, very top of mind conversation. I mean, we're definitely figuring it out as we go along. But I mean, I haven't grocery shopped in, almost 3 months. I almost never cook dinner, which I cook dinner nightly for 20 plus years of our marriage. So yeah, it's pretty significant. And I mean, I love that part. Like I don't mind not having to cook dinner every night. This is great. Um, yeah, and I think my husband's evolution of being the one that's more available during the day, being the one that is sort of following through on just, hey, did you pay that bill and did you do these things? I mean, he's still figuring out what he wants to do and whether or not he's going to go back to work, but I don't think we could do this without communicating about it pretty often. Like, we do kind of check in with each other like, hey, I mean, do you want me to cook dinner 1 or 2 nights a week? How does it? Because I mean, I think after the first week, he was kind of like, wow, this is a lot of work. And I was like, yeah, tell me something I don't know. So I think, just sort of staying in communication about it as much as we can has definitely helped. But it's a pretty big transition for sure.
What about, what about the kids with this too? Is this a layoff and experiencing a layoff as a family as a whole? Like, it's just a weird thing. It's a weird thing until it comes home and you're like, oh, this is what this thing is that maybe I heard somebody else's family talk about. And a lot of that I know is community driven too, because you can experience it through the friend's parent. What about that? How'd you guys talk to the kids about that?
And we're very transparent with our kids about finances. And I think that was their initial concern, was just, are we going to be okay? Like, do we, can we not afford to do the things that we like to do? And, just how big of a deal is this for kind of our day-to-day lifestyle? And so, I mean, my husband and I had a very in-depth conversation on our own about what we could afford and should we cut some things. And for the most part, our lifestyle isn't changing much, even though maybe we will travel a little bit less, or maybe we will buy less clothes or things like that. But we've really communicated that with both of our kids. It's like, hey, it's still okay to go to Starbucks or, go out to dinner here and there. We might do a little bit less of it. But those things, it's not like we can't afford to do that. So I think that was kind of their biggest concern at the outset was, are we going to be okay? Do we need to, sell our house and move someplace cheaper? Like some of these really significant changes. And we're like, no, it's fine. We're okay in the short term, maybe long term. There'll be some bigger changes, but for right now, for the most part, life is staying the same.
You didn't tell them they're moving back to Buffalo? You didn't,
I did not. I don't think that would go over well, but I mean, they'd love to be closer to family. Not in the cards. No.
Not in the cards.
It is cheaper. It's way cheaper.
I tell you this from Northeastern Pennsylvania, where fleeing New England and Chicago values, my wife and I are enjoying that very, very much.
I can imagine.
How big was it? And we're going to go back to the firm in a second, but just how big was it for not just already having the practice clear communication with, with your husband, with the family, but then also I imagine there was like enough of a plan together that you're like, this wasn't really in the cards, this exact scenario. We just got, the family just got dealt a blow we weren't expecting, but we already have all these puzzle pieces on the table. We just have to like rearrange them now. How big of a deal was that for you? Because it's easy to talk about somebody else's kids and somebody else's job and somebody else's career. It's really hard when it comes home to roost. How'd you handle that?
Yeah, it's ironic because the week that my husband was laid off, I was presenting to a local tech company it wasn't about layoffs specifically, but their company was going from public to private and layoffs were possible. And so we were talking very much about, being ready for such a thing. And it's very much in line with the work that we do as financial advisors. Like, do you have an emergency plan in place? And, if you do get laid off, what are some of the things to think about, whether it's claiming unemployment or getting COBRA coverage or all those things. So, I mean, we had a lot of that stuff in place, but then, it's like, okay, here's the emergency reserve. Now we're actually going to be spending from that emergency reserve. How long do we have? And really evaluating what that runway looked like. So yeah, it was definitely different to be on the other side of it for a change. But I think for the most part, we had, like I said, we had the systems in place to deal with a layoff. It's just a question of long term. Does that mean, now that my husband is retired, or does it mean he's going to go back to work, but maybe not right away? And yeah, we're still figuring that part out. But I think short term, it was very much like fire drill, like walk through all the steps of this is what you do when you get laid off. And so it was relatively seamless from the outset. But yeah, I think long term, still very much an open question.
There's a lot of value in having enough of it together to even just be able to say to the kids, say to each other, like, we're okay. Like, at least for right now. We're okay. Being able to utter those words is.
Yeah. That was really important, I think, to be able to say those exact words right out of the gate. It's like, yes, right now, everything is fine. We'll do a deeper dive and confirm, what that looks like for the family. But yeah, that was something the kids, I think, really needed to hear.
So not the first fire drill for you guys. I mean, I'm thinking about the story of how your firm came to be. That didn't come about in a pleasant, easygoing decision way. And you picked a really calm time in, the history of the world to
Yes, I did.
launch your
Yes.
business like a responsible entrepreneur. Could you
Yes. Early
maybe,
2020.
yeah, give me the lay of the land. You're coming into the year 2020. We've only heard whispers of this COVID thing.
Mhm.
Where are you working at the time, or what's the firm like you're working at the time? And then what
Mhm.
other pandemic hit your life?
Mhm. Early 2020, I was at a firm. So I had changed careers. I had been in the business for about 6 years at that point. And I worked at a firm based in Seattle here. It was a great firm. It was an entirely hourly firm. So sort of a different model than most financial planning firms. But I was very happy. I really liked the work. I really liked my coworkers. And I had no intention of launching my own firm. That had really never been on my radar. I did not think of myself as an entrepreneur. I had no aspirations to do my own thing. But through a series of, kind of unfortunate events, shall we say, um, my firm was audited. There was some challenges that came to light because of that. And through the whole process lasted about 12 weeks, somewhere in that range, 10 to 12 weeks. And I still was very resistant to the idea of launching a firm. I still just thought, oh, all of this administrative stuff will blow over and things will go on as they were before. Like things will just return to the state that they were in before the audit began. But after, like I said, about 2.5 to 3 months of being in that process, I had a pretty dramatic shift where it was like, I don't think I can just go back to the way things were. I think that ship has sailed. And I really, at first I thought, well, I'll just go get another job. I'll just look for a different firm. And so I, sort of entertained that idea for a little while and did some exploring on what was happening in my local market. And I just wasn't excited about the other options out there. And sort of, again, it's kind of the last thing on my list. I was like, well, I guess I could launch a firm. And once I really started to consider that, it was pretty obvious that was the direction I wanted to go. I was very, very inspired that was the path forward. But it was not an easy transition, and it was definitely unexpected.
How much in that one? Because unlike your husband's layoff in that situation that you're dealing with now, and granted, I know the beginning of that, and this obviously took weeks, months to play out with this job transition. You always just kind of assumed you were going to be on somebody else's ladder for this career. You were never standing up your own ladder. What was the thing that made you go, I actually just should set this up myself? This is ridiculous to try to start something else.
Well, I think that was actually the key piece of it, was that I realized, even though, for my entire life, and seeing both of my parents stay in very steady jobs with pensions, and they sort of like very quote unquote secure roles, that I thought, oh, this is the like financially responsible thing to do, and it's the safer thing to do is to be on somebody else's payroll, basically. And what I realized was, wow, I actually have a lot less control here than I thought I did. Well, very little control. And also, my income changed dramatically in that process. So my income dropped by about 50% due to, some structure in terms of client work, which I wasn't allowed to do, blah, blah, blah. That's sort of a longer story. But my income dropped by 50% during this process. And I was like, wow, my career might end because my company screwed up some paperwork. My income has dropped by 50%. And I was like, I thought this was the safe thing to do, is to work for another company, as opposed to doing something risky like launching a firm and not having a steady paycheck. But I realized, oh, this is not so reliable. And that was when my mindset really started to shift. It was like, oh, if it's not reliable to stay here, then why am I here? If the lure of security is a false, it's not something I can actually depend on, then why not take things into my own hands? So I basically decided, I want to be the only person that is in charge of my future. Like I don't want to be relying on a company. And again, it ties very much into how I feel about my clients and their finances. I don't want you to rely on somebody else or some other institution. I want you to be in as much control as you can be of your own destiny.
Do you remember, like, was it a weekend? Was it
Uh-huh.
what was the, before the edge and I'm over the edge? And it doesn't mean like there was one trigger. I'm sure it was a million things. If there was, by all means,
Uh-huh.
share it. But was it literally like a weekend? Was it you went to bed one night
Yeah.
and woke up? How'd the jump happen?
It was a weekend. Yeah, there was a weekend where I'd kind of been like sort of gradually coming around to this idea of like, I think maybe I need to launch a firm. I think that might be what I want to do. And yeah, and over the course of that weekend, it was 100% that is the only way forward for me. And as much as, my husband is like, well, like maybe we should think this through and maybe we should slow down and try some other things. And I was like, nope, I was pretty convinced that that was the only possible choice that I was going to be happy with.
When you know it's the only possible choice, like, what do you systematically, does the math person come out and you systematically break down the formula to your husband to justify why this is right? Or is it just, I've got this and here's the direction I'm running in now and go get him, Danika?
No, it was the latter. I was definitely running 100% on instinct. I was like, this is what I have to do. There's no doubt in my mind, this is the path that I want to take. And there wasn't a lot of like, well, let me just show you my business plan. I did some of those things, but that wasn't what it was about at all. I was just 100% going on, my gut instinct was telling me this is what I have to do.
Are you an instinct operator like that? Is that a normal theme across life, or did this kick in differently?
No, it is definitely. I like data and I certainly back things up with data and all of that. But when it comes to something like this, where I do have a really strong pull, that the data is kind of irrelevant at that point. So I do tend to operate a little bit more on instinct than you might otherwise assume based on my profession and my background and all that.
Because I'm really interested in this now, like the wheel of family. So first, like mom and dad, are they instinct operators or are they weigh all the data operators when you were growing up?
And that's a good question. I think my mom's more instinct and my dad is more of a data driven. Yeah.
Okay. So that was the mix.
Yeah. I think I'm a combination. I'm a combination of the two for sure.
Yeah. We're all combinations of them that manifest in weird ways. What about like next generational layer, like you and your husband? Are you both one-sided, more like gut insided, or is one of you the way the data and the other one's instinctual?
I'm definitely much more instinctual, but we're both we both like numbers. We both like data. We operate in very similar ways, but for sure, I'm the one that has more of that. There are times when, I don't really care what the data says. I've made up my mind.
Fantastic. What about the kids? Are they, and granted, I know like not exactly come into their own yet, but they're teenagers. We got we got strong takes here. What are you seeing in the mix there?
My 18-year-old really likes to have a plan and she really likes to know what's coming. So, she doesn't like surprises. She wants things to be kind of mapped out. So I think she's definitely more on the data and the, follow in a progression, not just sort of doing things by gut instinct. My younger daughter, a little more TBD, but yeah, probably a little more going by instinct, I would say.
Okay. So you're making sure to pass on the spread into the genetic gene pool for the future of humanity. I appreciate
Yes.
I appreciate that's the direction that is going. All right. We've got a ton of notes here and I've got a bunch of follow-up questions that I'm not going to miss. So I'm steering you through some of these things because you said some stuff we got to revisit. I have to ask you about the psychology of this. Recognizing the power in the name of the firm, even though you weren't like totally tied to the mythology of Xena, the TV series. What is it? Because I'm sure there's stuff now where you just have to understand this is the gut instinct coming out. Like you just have to understand what this drives, what this means for you to use it. Does this show up anywhere else in life, professional or personal?
Probably. I mean, I'm a very decisive person. I don't know if that's quite the direction you're going for, but I attribute some of that to, kind of like oldest daughter stuff and maybe growing up in the East Coast. But I usually have a strong, inclination about what's important to me, which direction I want to go. It's rare that I'm sort of sitting on the sidelines, kind of trying to figure out which move to make. Like I usually have a pretty clear direction that I want to go in. And so I think that's the biggest part of it. Like it shows up in literally everything that I do because it's just who I am. I'm kind of a strong personality, opinions about things. And so I'm rarely the person that's kind of like, I don't know. Like I almost always know. And if I don't know, I'll do some research and sort of figure it out. But it's pretty unlike me to waffle or hesitate. I'm pretty like, okay, well, we've decided we're going to launch a firm. Like, I guess it's time to do it. It's not like, oh, let's do some focus groups and think about it for 6 months and, create a bunch of spreadsheets. It's like, no, I'm launching a firm. Like, let's go. So I'm kind of pretty quick to move forward once I've come to a conclusion.
And there's some beautiful clarity about like picking a name for it, like setting up a business, calling it Xena, committing to a decision and saying like, we're all in. We already made the decision. Like we don't need to debate anything more. We just need something for us all to get behind. I feel like that must come across in a lot of your other work too. It's probably the simplification manifest.
And I think I'm also relatively willing to pivot, right? So it's like, I might make a decision and move forward. It's not like I'm totally locked in and, that's the only possible outcome. Like, I mean, I'm willing to adjust and change things along the way as needed. So I think there is a degree of flexibility there as well. That's important because otherwise I think if you're just brittle and like, this is, my way or the highway, that's not usually going to lead to very good outcomes. But yeah, I do think it's just, that's kind of my personality is to be pretty clear, pretty direct. And I'm usually confident in my decisions. Like I move forward with confidence. Again, I'm willing to be proven wrong. I'm willing to adjust. But I usually am going into things like, nope, this is how I feel. This is what I'm doing. And there's not I don't do a lot of like questioning or self-doubt, imposter syndrome. None of those things really resonate for me.
This is not a direct sentiment. It's just literally the next question I wrote down for myself. And it was when you're talking about your dad hating his job, but going back. And you literally said just kind of learning that value of wanting to feel or be inspired every day. I'm just curious, how do you think about it now? You've been doing the job, you've set up the firm for a few years. Obviously, life does nothing, if nothing else, throw surprises at us every day. What do you do to get yourself inspired every day? Or you don't have to do anything. It just like shows up. Something's always interesting.
I think so much of it is around the people that you surround yourself with, right? So do I wake up every single morning inspired? Of course not, right? I mean, that's not realistic. But I think putting myself in the company of other people who are regularly challenging their thinking on certain topics or seeking out it could be new hobbies. Like I've picked up, cross-country skiing in my 40s and now I'm like totally obsessed with skiing. But being willing to try new things and just surrounding yourself with people who have that approach to life as opposed to, nope, I'm good over here and like doing the exact same thing for 40 years. So I think a lot of it is about who you keep company with. And then another huge part of it is reading and listening to podcasts and just exposing yourself to other ways of thinking, other, traveling, all of those things I think are just key to staying engaged and stimulated. And there's sure to be things that spark your interest and inspire you along the way. But I don't think it's realistic for me to think that like, I'm going to wake up every morning and be inspired just inherently to, find the zest in my day. Like it's about being around people and things and just exposing myself to lots of different things. And there will, of course, be things that there's a thread that I want to pull on. And I'm like, ooh, that's something I want to learn more about, and continuing to follow that.
This connects to this point too, then. This idea of you in school, and you said taking random classes, but I know there was some method to the madness. But this is like the student version of that, is not being afraid to just sample from the smorgasbord in front of you. Like, I have this opportunity to spend this time. I'm going to take these psych classes, even though I'm a math major. How do you try to instill that in your kids? That same level of, it's okay to be curious about anything.
That one's really hard, actually. I think there's some of the same things that I just mentioned. I mean, we're big travelers, again, having family overseas, like we've always traveled pretty extensively with our kids. So getting them outside of their, Seattle bubble is a big part of it. And then again, seeing their parents pick up a new hobby, go back to grad school, launch a business, reinvent oneself after getting laid off. Like, seeing us do those things is what it's all about, right? So like, I can't tell my kids, oh, you should be curious about this thing, but they can see that that's how we lead our lives. And so, yeah, as much as I would love for my kids to sort of naturally be like, oh, I'm really curious about this and I want to learn more, I don't know that that's the easiest thing to impart, other than that's how we live. And so I think they just pick up a lot of that from our example. I hope so.
If you picked up all you picked up from your parents by example, I think that's a tried and true method. Let's talk about this. You were talking about your husband coming from Scotland and just, hey, we don't have 401ks in Scotland, stuff like that. This lack of generational knowledge. That's a really big thing. And I think we see it across, classes. We see it across genders. We certainly see it across, if we move across continental lines. How do you think about, like, in your own family's case, where you just have that cutoff of generational knowledge and deal with it firsthand?
Yeah. I think this is really critical to what we do as financial advisors, because I think our industry is so set up as like, we are the gatekeepers of certain kinds of knowledge, or we are the gatekeepers of certain, like, access to certain types of investments, like all that kind of stuff. I think it's really designed to be, we are the experts. You don't know anything. Allow me to help you have access to these things without necessarily explaining them. Like, it's not that I think our industry is great at encouraging our clients to have a lot of questions or to explore or to understand. It's just kind of like, I'll do the hard work and I'll make things easier for you. And so I really reject that mentality. And I want my clients to understand the reason why I'm making a recommendation about a certain investment. And I want them to be able to ask me about, different types of bonds, or like, why do I need emerging markets? Or, let's just talk about rates of return. Like, what does that even mean? So I do think our industry in general is not great at encouraging our clients to really understand a lot of things about, their financial lives. And so whether that's generational knowledge, whether that's you came from a different country, whether that's your parents never had enough to save, so maybe they didn't know what a Roth IRA was because that just wasn't even an option for them. I think as much as we can facilitate that sort of thing, and financial literacy isn't enough, to be clear. Like, I'm not saying we make everybody, educated about what a Roth IRA is and we've solved all people's financial problems. But I do think there is a way to encourage people to have more agency about their finances, to understand how the different pieces fit together, to ask good questions. And that's some of my favorite work with clients, is sort of seeing these like light bulbs go off in people's heads, where they're like, oh, I finally understand this stuff. Thank you for explaining it to me, and not patronizing me or judging me for having too much credit card debt, or all the things that I think happen way too much in financial services, where, a client is judged for not having the knowledge, asking a stupid question, having too much debt, etc.
How much of that is, I mean, that's like, you're literally describing teaching. You're literally deciding, it's not parenting, but it's It's a very like
Mm-hmm.
one-to-one in person. We're going to work out this understanding and this orientation towards why together.
Uh-huh.
Did you deeply feel that connection, that this is like, it's almost a conversational learning approach to unlocking this stuff inside people's
Mm-hmm.
heads?
Uh-huh. Yes, and that's not scalable, right? So like at the end of the day,
Yes.
I mean, I would love to be able to take that to a broader audience. And I think there's ways to do that, whether it's, YouTube videos or some kind of course or something like that. And I think that there's so many people have tried to crack that. And there's lots of things out there currently that you can go and learn. There's some great people who are doing content on YouTube and whatever. There's free and one-to-many types of platforms out there. But I do think that's important too, because the one-to-one, I mean, it's wonderful when I can do that kind of work with a client, but I can only work with 50 or 60 clients, and I want to have a bigger impact than that.
What do you think it's going to be? How are we going to have a better group? Like, how are we going to expand the footprint of this stuff? Or is this part of the calling to, is this why you show up in the media? Is this why you show up in my podcast feeds and other places talking about this stuff? Like, you're
Ding, ding,
called to
ding.
spread this more. You're
Yeah,
called to.
no, I am 100%. And so that is a big part of why I've gotten into more public speaking and things like that, or why I talk about issues that I think are important for our industry, because not a lot of people are talking about it. And it's like, well, I think diversity is really important. I'm going to stick my neck out and really advocate for that, because, that's another way for me to get different types of people into our industry, and then they can serve other people. I mean, I think so much of it is around, the predominant voices in our industry look and sound very similar. And I think the more that we can encourage different types of people to get into this industry, that makes it more accessible for lots of people that have not been welcomed by financial services historically. And so that is a huge part of why I have taken such an active role in sort of speaking out and advocating for things like diversity.
Where does that come from inside you? Were you always that kid, like growing up? Did you have that fairness instinct?
It wasn't so much about, I don't think it's so much about fairness for me. And no, I was not that kid. But I did grow up. I mean, I grew up in like an inner city, kind of impoverished part of the world. Like Buffalo, New York is not a real economic hotbed. And, it was pretty normal for it. At the time, I don't think it was a majority Black city, but it is now. Buffalo is a majority Black city. And so my classes, I mean, it was very diverse when I was a kid, both racially and economically. And so I think that just felt natural to me. And so to move into spaces where it doesn't feel representative of the world that we live in did feel kind of almost jarring when I, entering into sort of like financial services, for instance, where it's so skewed to, upper middle class, almost entirely white men. That just felt like, oh, but this doesn't look like the world that we live in. Like, what's going on here? So it was not so much about fairness. It just, it doesn't feel like an accurate representation. It's not an accurate representation. And so I do think that's a big part of it for me. And I also think because of the different experiences I've had, even going away to college and, again, didn't have a lot of money. And some of the kids, like I'd never been around that kind of wealth before. And so being in different environments and getting exposed to so many different types of people, and then working in an industry where I feel like that's so limited, it's like, we're really missing out on all these different voices and all these different experiences that I think would make our industry so much richer, and would be able to reach a much more diverse and extensive part of the population.
That last part about, if you bring more people into it, the whole ecosystem has broader reach. This isn't the first time you've had this thought, clearly. How do you actually think about that? What does that mean for you, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years forward, as you keep trying to poke at this?
I think it's about, at the end of the day, I think it's about treating each person as, seeing them as a full human being. And so being able to recognize their immigrant status and really being able to appreciate what that actually means for them. Again, I don't have that experience, so I can't know exactly what it's like, but I have a pretty good idea, sort of seeing what my husband has been through and kind of his evolution and having to learn a whole new financial system and moving to this country without having any credit and, like just watching him navigate. So I think it's about being able to appreciate and honor all of the things that each person brings to the table rather than saying like, well, this is our system. And like, you have to sort of conform to the structures that already exist. I've had so many interactions with, I have many clients that are members of the LGBTQ community and some really terrible stories about, like people that just advisors that they've worked with that just work like kind of unable to imagine how it would be possible to have, two women married to each other. And just like they're, all the systems are very much structured for one man and one woman, things like that, that just, it's very dehumanizing to go into a situation where, you're not acknowledged. So I think really that's what it comes down for me is that sort of acknowledgement and respect for each person and how they show up.
Have you found yourself as you travel around and talk about this stuff more publicly and as vocally as you are, which this is one of my favorite things about you. I love that you're just willing to kind of say what's on your mind and then put it back in a constructive framework, which is so often the missing ingredient. People want to get angry about this stuff. They don't want to get constructive about this stuff.
Yeah.
And it feels like it really ties back into this idea of, what you went through on your entrepreneurial journey, this seeing like your future and your happiness are actually, that's a combined, those are two variables that have to be added together. You can have your future, but you still might be miserable. Well, part of it is going to require that you own both of those things. Here's the direction I'm going in, and here's what makes me happy. And I guess just communicating to other people from different walks, like, oh, you have this option too. Might not look like them, might have their experience. The whole system might be designed this way, but let me tell you, you can stand this up on your own. Do you feel that in your work? Do you know that you're putting that message out there so clearly?
I think I do. I mean, I think I have a pretty, I'm relatively self-aware, as I like to think. And certainly with some of my work with clients and certainly the feedback I get from other advisors in the industry about some of the content I put out and things like that. I mean, I've definitely gotten enough feedback that I'm pretty cognizant that sort of the way that I'm showing up is, I don't know that I'm giving other people permission, but
No.
there's a sort of like setting a precedent, like, oh, well, here's somebody who's, vocally taking a stand, like, oh, maybe I could do my own version of that. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but there is definitely a sense of like, I show up in the world in the way that feels authentic to me. And I don't expect anybody else to do that. Like a lot of people have zero interest in taking any kind of stand or, even just posting on LinkedIn regularly or whatever. Like any of that stuff could be very off-putting for a lot of people. And so I don't think this is I'm not saying everybody should do this. But that's just kind of, it's who I am. It feels very natural to me. And so I guess the main thing for me is that everybody feels the comfort to do what's natural for them. It's not going to look like what I do.
I don't think there's a better precedent to set with people than that. It's going to look like you. It's going to look like what it's going to look like for you. That's not for me or you or anybody else to judge or decide on. But that's the precedent. Go do you.
That is the precedent. You do you. Yes, exactly. Unless I don't like you, and then you got to do something better. Just kidding. I'm kidding.
And then do better. No,
well, okay there are times
that too. Yeah, it's okay. It's
there are
okay to say that.
times when I definitely do say that. And, I think there are a lot of people in our industry and out of our industry that are doing a reasonably good job with a lot of things and also could do a better job. And I think it's okay to say that as well. And actually, I hope people say that to me. I welcome that kind of pushback. And if it's constructive, that people can say, hey, you say that this is important to you, but actually you're kind of like not really doing that. It's like, oh yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Like it's not easy to get criticism like that, but I welcome that because I think that's how we grow, is being held accountable and say like, hey, you could do better here. And I'm sure everybody can do better. Like literally every single one of us can do better in some aspect of our lives. So I'm not opposed to people calling me out, again, if it's constructive. So yeah, I'm definitely not shy about that.
Danika, if people want to follow you, connect with you, where should they look you up on the internet these days?
Probably LinkedIn. That seems to be, now that X, formerly Twitter, is a total cesspool. It seems to be where I spend most of my time. So yeah, LinkedIn, Danika Waddell.
All right, we'll make sure all the links to the firm and to you are somewhere in the comments below, but you're easy to find. Danika Waddell, you are truly an intentional investor. Thank you so much for the time today.
Thanks, Matt. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe wherever you're watching The Intentional Investor so more people can find our show. You can follow Matt directly at cultishcreative.com or at cultishcreative on Twitter. For more great content at the intersection of investing and life, check out epsilontheory.com or at epsilontheory on Twitter.